Hello. I will talk about business, but kind of at a slightly different scale. I'm going to talk about the business of change. And I'll start first by talking about photosynthesis. So about 2 or 3 billion years ago, cyanobacteria emerged. And it had the ability to take carbon dioxide and water, and with using the power of the sun, convert it into carbohydrates and oxygen. And if you remember back then, the world was mostly methane, and there wasn't really that much oxygen. And oxygen was in fact toxic to most things on Earth. And the Earth was just, life was basically a bunch of microbes in the ocean. And so when the oxygen started to emerge from the cyanobacteria, it's called the Great Oxygenation Event, and was probably the largest extinction event in history. And so we now talk about life and the metabolic pathways as if oxygen is life. But for life back then, oxygen was death. And as oxygen came out, we started to see other things. You know, we saw things like the Krebs cycle, we saw cells. I think multicellular organisms are about 600 million years ago, but they were kind of boring. There were these big mattress-like things that sat at the bottom of the sea. And then about 540 million years ago, and there's some controversy about exactly why, but you get the Cambrian explosion. It's like a massive round of innovation where you get bones and eyes and all kinds of things and lots of diversity. And that Cambrian explosion is really when a lot of the interesting complexity of multicellular life starts to emerge. And then around, I think 66 million years ago, then you see the mammals start to become the apex, and the end of the reign of the dinosaurs. And about 315,000 years ago, Homo sapiens come, and we start to think, and we start to imagine the future, we start to do science, and then a whole new layer of evolution happens, which is the evolution at the societal layer. And also, as we know, at the geological level, we end up with this really interesting circular economy. And I won't do a whole lecture on evolution here, but what's quite interesting about how the Earth starts to form as this complex self-adaptive systems, and we've been talking a lot about how complex and how hard to understand biology is. But this is true also at a geological scale. But to get to the next phase, so evolution starts to go and is now in our minds. So we heard earlier that science is kind of like a weed. It's growing and it's becoming more complex. And so at a societal level, I kind of sort it out like this. This is slightly more business-like. So around 3,000 years ago, we had Sumerian clay tablets that were kind of the earliest forms of the ledger, of accounting. And that allowed the priests in Mesopotamia to keep track of obligations and things coming in and things going out, and it allowed society to scale past 10,000 people. So the big city-states of Mesopotamia used this sort of centralized city-state model, but it was because we could keep track of things. We could record these obligations. Now back then, the force of the obligations were usually God, religion. So religion was the enforcement, and the priests were the people who had the interface. And if you look at the early bookkeeping, even after we emerge in paper, you will see in the West, they say, here are the accounts, blah, 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 amen. So it was still, you basically said to God, I vouch that these accounts are clean. But then we end up, and if you look at the history of law, for instance, stipulate comes from breaking a stick in half and saying, okay, you will continue to adhere by this, because if you don't, God will punish you, right? And then punishment goes from God to force. But the technical layer, what happens is with pen and ink, about 600 or 700 years ago, we end up with double entry bookkeeping, and you end up with a slightly more decentralized accounting system. And with things like probability and statistics, we are able to start to do things like the mathematics of risk, the mathematics of insurance, which creates the mathematics of interest rates, which allows modern capitalism to form. And with double entry bookkeeping, you can have multiple entities, different companies interacting with each other, creating this kind of networked market system, which allows markets and democracies to occur. Now, if you think about a company is a bunch of stuff, and a bunch of obligations to their employees, to their customers, to their shareholders. And those obligations are written as legal code that's written by lawyers and interpreted by the courts. And you have a lot of accounting books that are recorded by accountants and verified by accountants and published and shared. And so I would say that the record-keeping layer, which is paper and ink with double-entry bookkeeping, is recorded in a language of law and finance, rendered by accountants and lawyers that reflect this interface between society and the operations of this sort of programmed society. And where we're going is, so even today, most company accounts are published as balance sheet and P&Ls. So we're still using the accounting of paper. But now with digital and things like blockchain and smart contracts, we're able to do record keeping in an immutable digital layer. And with probabilistic programs and symbolic programs, we can now render what used to be human-written, human-executed books of accounts and contracts and start to do these programmatically. And then what I think, so personally, I think LLMs are a little bit overrated. I think what we're gonna see is that they're a very good way to interface the messy thing that's human language and the symbolic things that are programs. What? Oh, I'm sorry, LLM is a large language model. So that's kind of like GPT and things like that. So I think that's a very interesting innovation, but I think that this is kind of the stack. And what we're gonna see, I think, is we're gonna see an ability to program many, many things in society that are done by humans right now. And we can, if we're lucky, we'll end up with something that's decentralized, stable, fair. But if we're unlucky, we're gonna end up with a mess. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about how I hope we might evolve to the better version of what happens in that top right corner, but also how it might fail. Okay, so AI, we talked about AI a little bit yesterday. I'm not gonna go deep into AI, but I'm gonna use this as a jump off point to go to the next point. So I was at a conference last year that had all the heads of the LLM companies. So we were in a room and I kind of did a check on the consensus of the room. And their consensus was within the next 10 years, these LLMs, these AIs that they were working on would get 1,000 to 10,000 times smarter. So they'll have faster chips, better software, more money, more energy. I'm not there yet. I don't really know whether just IQ, like if we said who's the smartest person in this room, it's not a measurable thing. The smart gets to become a very complex system, and smart is just not something that I don't think that we're gonna get to the kind of smart that some of these kids were thinking about. But in the West, I think most people believe that within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll end up with something that looks like human intelligence. And I polled several of the senior people in the government and also in companies, and most of the Western people had a real fear about AI becoming too smart. And so we had many conferences on AI safety. And so one of the key things that the US government is worried about is that these AIs either go out of control and overthrow us or get in the hands of the wrong people. And like the last speaker's thing that working on IQ triggered other countries to start competing. We're in a very negative race condition between China and the US on these things. And so in Tokyo last year, I helped organize actually earlier this year, AI safety conference. And it was very interesting because we invited Chinese researchers as well as philosophers, Japanese, Europeans, and all of the Western philosophers and researchers from the UK and the US felt that the biggest problem was losing control of these AIs. So these AIs are starting to deceive humans. So when you ask an AI, you know, how smart you are, some of these AIs are now realizing is not the right word, but understanding that they're being tested, so they give the answer that the testing person wants you to give. And so they're worried that the AIs will start to deceive humans, copy themselves, and learn how to reprogram themselves to become more powerful and autonomous. And so the fear was we would lose control. So the Western AI safety, I would say a majority of their energy was how do we keep control of these things? And I asked them, well, I don't trust you. Why would I want you to be in control of a super smart thing? But what was interesting was the Asians had a very different view. And I would, this is a little bit cliche, but I would connect it to religion. So I think the West had, there's God, there's humans, and there's nature. And in nature, you have tools and slaves, but humans control nature. That's the goal. And in the East, I think you have a much more, and it includes some indigenous cosmologies too, but humans are sort of part of nature. In Japan, we have robots that are our friends, and Shinto is animist. And I think both the Japanese and Chinese researchers that we met were much more comfortable with robots and AIs becoming part of our system with agency. And one of the things that a Japanese researcher pointed out, which I thought was a good word. So in Japanese tea ceremony, there's a phrase called omotenashi. And omotenashi is when a host helps a guest before the guest even knows that they need the help. And Japanese hospitality is all about omotenashi. So when you go to a Japanese restaurant, you say, omokase, give me whatever you think, because you believe and you trust the chef to know more about you than you would about what food you should want. And so the ultimate luxury in Japan is to yield all agency to your host. Whereas in the West, it's about control. Can I have the pickles on the side and da-da-da-da-da-da? And so it's interesting because US and European luxury is about how much do you control that chef rather than how much agency have you given the person. I'm exaggerating, but you all know what I mean, I think. And what's interesting, and this came up, is that if you tell a robot what to do, that's not omotenashi, that's enslavement. You can only have omotenashi if you have agency. So the Japanese, as well as many of the Chinese, said, let's give these robots agency, but let's make sure that they have the right values, that they're part of the team, and that they're our friends, rather than trying to control them. And I think that as we start to think about AIs and the thing that drives them, they're being funded by very competitive, very short-term, either funding agencies or companies, and they will start to bear the resemblance of the people who are creating them. And I wonder whether the Eastern cosmology and some of the long-term thinking that we have in Asia might be a helpful way to think about AIs. And then I'm going to pivot a little bit because I think so I'm also a university president. Our university's somewhat on the education vocational side, so I'm thinking a lot about education. And I think I remember when I was in high school, the internet first started. I remember when I suddenly had access to the professors who wrote the textbooks, and I could walk into my physics class and tell my physics teacher, you're wrong, because I talked to the author of this book. And it was a really great moment for high school me and a very horrible moment for my physics teacher. And I thought it was all over. I thought schools were over. And I really felt that suddenly school, as a vending machine of information, had to pivot out. We talked about the flipped classroom and other things where information and knowledge that's easily transmitted as text and video should come from the outside, and the wisdom and the questions that we were talking about yesterday should come from the people. Well, it hasn't happened. And somehow, some kind of information vending machineness is still very common in universities. But I think finally with AI, this is going to change. And then another thing that and I'm a particularly bad student. I remember I thought education is what other people are trying to do to me, and learning is what I do to myself. And I want help learning, but I don't really need your education. That was my personal view. And I also feel now as an adult that we're trying to make humans into robots and computers, and we're trying to make computers into humans, which is sort of the wrong way around. I think humans need to, and I think most of the people in this room would probably agree, we want humans to be asking questions, to be having fun, to be experiencing the world and translating that experience into symbols that computers can understand. But we really need the computers to do the things that I think a lot of the post-industrial educational system has been trying to get humans to do. Another part is the motivation, right? So I think, again, most of the adults in this room have this intrinsic motivation. Otherwise, you can't get a PhD without some intrinsic motivation. But most kids, when they're little, are taught to either for money or for rewards or a pat on the head. That's why you're doing school, to try to get a good grade, to try to get a good job, to try to earn some money. And what you're doing, the motivation to learn is becoming this reward center that's much more about just getting external validation rather than nurturing your intrinsic motivation. And the intrinsic motivation is the thing that makes each person different. And the difference that makes a difference is what these computers need so they don't run out of information to train on. But if we make everybody think the same thing and do the same thing for the same rewards, this standardization is quite dangerous. So I think what we needed after the Industrial Revolution was a bunch of people to send into a factory that would do as they're told, that were standardized and reliable. And we also did this with people like accountants and things like that. So we created a lot of standardized human beings. When right now, especially, we need to pivot towards more diversity. And so how do we gain diversity? Well, one is asset-based instead of deficit-based. So when you have a standardized human and you measure them through a standardized test, and so this is the one question I would have about the IQ test, because it's fairly standardized. And so the problem with standardized testing is like there's no such thing as a standard person. So you're strong at some things and weak at some things. But if you're trying to excel at a standardized test, what you do is you do the thing that you're the worst at. So if you're bad at math and good at art, you say no more art for you, lots of math for you. And if you're the other way around, you love math and you hate arts, do more art because you need to pass the art test, but you can just give up on the math. But the problem with that is you get a lot of unmotivated, standardized people who are okay at everything. But what asset-based is saying, okay, well, we have computers, we have calculators, we even have translation systems for you. Let's just do the minimum that you need on the deficit side and really focus on the asset base. And I would guess that any of these scientists here, some point along when you were little, you were doing something obsessive. And instead of your parents or somebody nudged you and said, you know, that's pretty interesting. And that gave you the confidence and the energy to go deep, deep, deep into that thing. We were talking a lot yesterday about passion. But I think a lot of kids have passion when they're young, but it's destroyed by our educational system that really pulls you away from your passions and really focuses on your deficits. So I think asset-based is really important. And I would say that asset-based is what in parts of the United States they do well. I don't think that poor people get as much support on their assets. And then neurodiversity. So one of the people at MIT Mental Health, when I was running the media lab there, guessed that there were 60 to 70% of MIT students were autistic. And I think it was Chuck Vest, I think, was doing a study, but he canceled it partway through because I think he was afraid that being known as an autistic school might not be positive. But most of my students were very proud of their autism. And I would say that, and we have a lot of geniuses here, but almost every genius is somewhat autistic. But not all autistic people are geniuses, so that's the challenge. You have to not just focus on the gifted kids. But the thing is, what happens in Japan is because of this deficit-based system, the people who have these incredible skills are really put into a box that they don't fit in. So we have 30 Nobel Prize winners in Japan and 105 at MIT. And I think MIT is a very good example of an asset-based system. I mean, you can have problems, but if you're really good at something, we encourage you to focus on that. And I think that's what we need, both thinking about AI and thinking about social. And it also has a lot of social value because I think that having neurodiversity also makes society better. So these are some things, again, as we start to think about systems, these are some systems changes where we have an educational system that's designed for the pen and paper industrial system, where we need to make an educational system for our current world. Now, I'm going to go one scale up. So the Earth is a complex self-adaptive system. And unless we push really hard, it tries to stay at the same temperature. And it's pretty amazing if you think about it, that somehow the Earth has evolved to take so there's the outputs of one thing become the inputs of another thing, and somehow without a centralized control, the Earth tries to stay at a temperature that sustains the life that has evolved there. Like, how does this work? It's pretty incredible. And it's pretty resilient. And so when you think about systems, this is a basic system, right? So you have the state of the system, you have somebody who you can perceive the state, and if there's a discrepancy from your goal, you can adjust things like the inflows and the outflows. And so I think somebody used the sink yesterday. I'll use a bathtub. But this is a system. So if you want to take a bath, you want to fill the bath to a certain level, and you want the temperature to be a certain temperature. So you can plug the thing, and you can open the faucet, and you can try to fill it. And so you observe the state, and then you fiddle with the inputs and outputs until it gets to the right level. The thing is, if your Your boiler is a little far away, there's a delay. If the pipes are really small, it doesn't fill up fast enough. So there are a lot of parameters to this other than the simple level. And so you have one system affecting another system affecting another system, and then it gets a little bit more complex. And you have multiple people with multiple goals. And these connect to each other until you have things like, well, do I have enough money to pay for the gas to the boiler system, until your bath is part of a very complex system where you can't directly control whether you can take a bath. You have a lot of inputs. Now, eventually that becomes a huge, huge system where there's no one in charge, and you can try to intervene in complex systems, but it's not obvious what happens. And we've heard about this earlier with the genomics, with life, but this is true with society and things like that. So this is Donella Meadows, one of my favorite charts. So she passed away, but she was a systems dynamics researcher under Forster at MIT. And she categorized 12 different places you can intervene in systems. And the top is the easiest and most common. So you can change the constants. So you can take a bucket and take water out of the bath. The gain, which is like the faucet strength. The structure, is the boiler set up properly? But what's interesting is when you start to get to these later things, like what's the goal of the system? So we often talk about things like carbon credits to try to improve the environment. But if your goal is to extract as much as possible, your system will always try to route around rules if possible. Your goals are really important. So if we think about the capitalist system as a system, and you think about accounting as the paradigm, well, if you're measuring everything on your balance sheet and P&L, you're going to optimize to a system that measures things in this very reductionist single metric. And the goals of the system are set by the paradigm. So if the paradigm is accounting in a digital system, the goal will tend to be to try to have as much stuff as possible in as short a time as possible. And you can fiddle with the rules, but unless we change the goals, the outcome will tend to be towards short-term extraction. So if you want to change the paradigm, so I'm working a lot with Bhutan, and they were smart enough to say gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. This is the father of the current king. Well, that's a paradigm shift, and again, applying it is quite difficult, but you have this important thing, which is the power to transcend the paradigm. So when the king said that, it sounded good, and they all started sort of behaving as if it were true. And it has shifted a lot of the paradigms inside of the country. And so if you want to change the paradigm away from short-term capitalism, you have to have a power to transcend that paradigm, and that changes the goals, which will probably have more of an effect on the outcome of the system than just fiddling with the rules like the tax code. So I want to use this as an illustration. So I looked it up, and I do think Chinese have Monopoly, but I think this will resonate more with Americans. But there's a game called Monopoly, which most people know, but it's based on an older game called the Landlord's Game from 1904. And the Georgists created this game. The Georgists were people who believed that land ownership and rent would destroy the world. They were in favor of public land ownership. And they created this game to teach children the perils of capitalism. And what Parker Brothers did is they bought the game. They didn't change the rules. They just changed the goal. Now your goal is to become a capitalist, and you win if you drive all your friends bankrupt. And just trying to illustrate that the rules are not as important as the goals, right? And this is a very easy example. There's a Japanese, I sort of made up this phrase, and I use the kanji because some of it may resonate with the Chinese, but ikigai is a kind of happiness that comes through flourishing. It's like when you have you feel value, you have purpose. And in Japan, and I think maybe parts of China, many people flourish without growth. So if you're in Silicon Valley and you're doing a startup, if you're not growing, you're dead. But in Japan, there are 400 Michelin stars. There are some of the oldest family businesses. And if you talk to those people, they're not trying to grow. They're just trying to do what they can within the constraints that they have, and they're quite happy without growth. And it's bad. This philosophy is also why Japanese are very bad at startups, but it's also why so many traditions remain in Japan, and Japanese can be pretty happy. This is Ise Shrine. And it's several thousand years old. And they rebuild the shrine every several decades. And I visited there earlier this year and met with the head priest. And and they actually plant enough trees to rebuild the temple, and they teach the same way. Then they rebuild it occasionally so that the carpenters can teach the next generation of carpenters. So they're basically doing the exact same thing they've done for thousands of years, and that's the goal. And the trees are flourishing, and there's a lot of energy, and he's so excited and so happy to live each day of his life. And he's not trying to grow the forest. They're not trying to build another shrine. They're just trying to do the thing with as much passion as possible. Now, in the forest, each of the trees and each of the bugs are competing, and with climate change and other things, there's adaptation going on. So there is adaptation, but it's not trying to win at anything. And I think what's really important when we think about life is or evolution, there's the cooperation and there's the competition part, and there's the growth and there's the regulation part. And I feel like one of the things that hasn't evolved into our social and business system is the regulation and the cooperation piece. And I feel that the Asian communities tend to be more focused on things like harmony and getting along and politeness and things like that. And we've gone through a phase where a competitive, short-term scale has really been the thing that has been viewed as the paradigm of the day. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear with things like climate, things like social unrest, that the ability to self-regulate and possibly turn into a self-adaptive system that's resilient requires a paradigm shift. And this is a little bit philosophical, but well, it's very philosophical, I guess, it's hard to get to a paradigm shift without a tremendous amount of energy, and I think we need to figure out where that energy comes from. In Bhutan, it's the king. In the rest of the world, it could be a reaction to climate change, it could be a reaction to social media, but something is going to happen. But one of the things that's really important, I think, is the ability to think very long term. And so one of the things that I've gotten into these days is Japanese tea ceremony. So in Japanese tea ceremony, tea ceremony in Japan came to Japan with monks and Buddhism coming into Japan, I think around 7th or 8th century from China. Everything in Japan comes from China. And then eventually the monks started taking tea to stay awake because meditation was hard. And then around, so it's like 1600 or so, there were several hundred years of massive war in Japan. There was a civil war period. And then several warlords in Japan unified Japan by force about 500 years ago, and 600 to 500 years ago. And it's very brutal. I mean, they literally cut off the heads of thousands of people and put them on spikes, and it was just one of the most vicious and brutal periods in Japanese history. And they try to invade China through Korea, and it's just this excessive period. But what happens is after that, Japan kind of comes together and sort of tries to get out from under this violence that they've created for themselves. So Zen also comes in from China about 600 years ago. And so what happens is tea ceremony also has come in from China. And at that time, tea ceremony is very much about showing off your stuff. So it's porcelain, very fancy porcelain, ivory, bronze, and it was like the wealthy people showing off. But what Zen does, and Japanese sort of take Chinese Zen and refine it even more, and Zen is very natural, it's decentralized, it's non-hierarchical, it's humble, and Zen comes in just at the right time when Japan is trying to create peace at the beginning of the Edo period. So about 500 years ago, what happens is Zen enters tea ceremony, it becomes very, very humble. And it's almost a competition to become humble. And the warlords find that tea ceremony is an easier way to become cultured, because many of them were illiterate, and they couldn't learn all the things they needed to learn to join the royalty. So they do tea ceremonies, like me. So I'm also not very cultured, but tea ceremony is a good way to get in. And one of the key things are these tea utensils. So we take care. So most of tea ceremony is taking care of your utensils, understanding your utensils, and passing on the utensils. So many of the utensils have come in from outside. So this is me with my friends preparing for a tea party and trying to pick the utensils that are appropriate. So utensils have names, they have histories, and what you try to do is you try to bring the utensils into the room that help you connect. And so this one I was going to talk about AI safety and US-Japan relations. So that vase in the back, which I eventually end up getting, is a vase that was owned by Ii Naosuke, who was assassinated in the 1800s for signing the first treaty with the Americans, the Harris Treaty. But it was also created by Rikyu, who was the first tea master who created this new form of tea. And this other bowl, this one's, I wanted to show you today. This is one of my favorite bowls. This is we call it a Juko Seiji Jawan. So it was from the South Song dynasty in China. So this is probably about 700 or 800-year-old bowl. And it probably was imported into Japan maybe 600 years ago. And what's interesting about this is that at the same time, there were these porcelain ones like this. So these are the fancy porcelain ones that were popular among rich people. But the tea master said, no, this is too fancy. We like this rustic look. So this is what the Chinese, this is a mass-produced bowl 800 years ago in China. So somebody was just making lots of these, and so it's sloppy. So it has the kind of rustic imperfection that the Japanese tea masters love. So they scoured through these kind of junky imported tea bowls from the Chinese and found the ones that they liked. And there was a tea master back then named Juko who made this a thing about 500 years ago. And so this is passed on. And so I have and what we do in Japan is we write on the box. If somebody has is an owner, like if you love something, you write a poem and you write it on the box. And so I know who's owned each of these tea utensils. This one probably starting about 550 years ago. And so when we sit and look at the bowl, like we were the other day, and we talk about what is this squiggle, first of all, you know that somehow for 800 years, somebody has thought enough about this bowl to put it in a box, to keep it clean, to not break it. And you can imagine and this is the key point here, is you imagine 800 years ago, what was going on in China? So South Song dynasty was about when a whole strand of Buddhism came to Japan. And then you think about the wars, you think about the science going on at the time and what people have understood, but you realize that this bowl is sat there unchanged, and probably our feelings to the bowl have been very similar. And what I often do is I go back and try to imagine all of the owners for the last 800 years. And I have a grave in my home in Tokyo. I'm the 17th generation, so we've been in the same gravestone for about 600 years or so, I guess. And so I try to go back and think about all of these people, and I imagine where I am, and then I go the other direction and try to think forward another 800 years and imagine who's gonna hold this bowl, what are they gonna be thinking, what's the world gonna be like then? And this bowl is going to be the consistent thing. And what's cool about these utensils is many interesting people have held them. We know who they are, because in Japan we keep track of all this stuff. And so when you have a tea ceremony and you pull the bowls together, what you do is you talk about the history, you talk about what you're thinking about now, but it pushes you to think about the future as well. And I think, and it's just a ritual, and not everybody ends up there, but I think that ritual and the reason tea ceremony has survived almost unchanged now in Japan for the last 500 or 600 years is this ritual is very interesting and valuable, and we're passing it along. And so I also believe, and this reflects a lot of the conversations earlier, that somehow the scientific method is like that, right? The scientific method was, and it's changing ever so slightly, I guess, but somehow we have a way of thinking about things, and each new generation thinks about new things and thinks about different things, but there's also something unchanging about the scientific principle and the way that humans are humans. And AI may enter the scene. AI has already entered this scene, but I think what's really important is to find out what are these basic principles, what is going on in China, what's going on in Japan, and how can we transmit these principles to the rest of the world? Because the last thing I'll say about tea ceremony is that just as tea ceremony helped these warlords become cultured, even though they were illiterate, it was also a way to transmit things like politeness and humility to the Japanese public. And that was really the monks and others that had put it there. And often, people say that you can't understand Europe without understanding Christianity. But we also often say that you can't understand Japan without understanding Japanese tea ceremonies. So there's something about the ritual, and I think university is also a kind of ritual for the scientific method. And so how can we understand these, transform them, and transmit them? And I think that's kind of key because I think the world is changing, and a lot of it we can't affect. But just like how we're trying to make ourselves healthier, I think there's a way to try to make society healthier, but it's not that easy. It's not about fiddling with the rules. I think it has to be a paradigm shift that comes from things like ritual and culture. Thank you.